Jesus traveled all over the place, teaching and doing miracles. Everywhere he went, people followed him. In fact, people wanted to be as close to him as possible. Well, one day, as Jesus was walking to a nearby town, he came upon 10 men standing just outside of town. Well, these men were careful to keep their distance from anyone entering the town because they had a disease called leprosy. Now, people with leprosy, they were kicked out of their homes and forced to live outside of town because the rest of the healthy people, they were afraid they'd get leprosy too. In fact, people were so afraid to be around anyone with leprosy that they made a law and required them to stay away from everyone else. So this meant that those who were sick, well, they had to stay away from even their families and their friends. Can you imagine how lonely and scary it would be to have leprosy? So these 10 men who had no friends and were really, really sick saw Jesus. And when they saw Jesus, they got really, really excited. Well, unlike most people who ran to Jesus, they stayed far back from Jesus. But that didn't keep them from calling out to him. You see, they cried out for Jesus to help them. They knew what Jesus could do, and they hoped and hoped that Jesus would stop and heal them. Well, Jesus heard these men. He walked over to them, which was the first amazing thing he did. Because remember, everyone else was too scared to get close to them. But then Jesus did something even more amazing. He talked to them. And he told them to go to the temple and talk to the priest there. That's the place where most people worshiped God. But they were lepers. They weren't allowed to go in the temple. And they especially weren't allowed to talk to the priest. But that's what Jesus told them to do. So they obeyed. Now, I'm sure these men were excited and a little nervous. They could get in a lot of trouble for going back into the city. Remember the law that said they had to stay outside the city walls? Well, they were breaking the law when they went back to the temple. They must have wondered how Jesus was going to heal them and what would be waiting for them at the temple. They probably started dreaming what it would be like to take off all their bandages for good and finally start seeing their family and friends again. These men, they'd been sick for a long time. And to be healed of leprosy, that wasn't something that happened because there was no cure for leprosy. Well, as the men ran to the temple, their bandages began to fall off. And when they started to put them back on, they realized something was different. They had already been healed. All their sores were gone, and they no longer needed the bandages. Can you imagine how excited they were? All 10 men had been healed of a disease that had no cure. Jesus had healed them. Jesus didn't even have to touch them to heal him. He just did it. But then one man turned back, amazed that sores no longer covered his body. He was filled with thanks. So he turned around and ran back to Jesus. And when he found him, the man fell at Jesus' feet. Thank you, the man said to Jesus. Jesus looked around. He asked the man where the other 9 men were. He wanted to know why this man was the only one that came back. But Jesus, he already knew the answer. He knew that this man was thankful. So he looked at the man and told him that he could go. He was healed. Now, all 10 men were healed, and I'm sure all of them were thankful to Jesus for healing them. But only one man took the time to come back and say thank you. He knew what an amazing thing had just happened. He knew that Jesus did something that no one else could do. He had cured his disease. He had just been healed by Jesus.